morning. My name is Mary Villas. I'm the president of PSC Partners Seeking a Cure Canada. And together with Ricky Safer, CEO and founder of PSC Partners Seeking a Cure, we welcome you to the first webinar of 8 in the post-conference educational series, PSC and IBD, what everyone wants to know about diet and nutrition, with speakers Josh Korzenik and Jennifer Lai, and moderator Dan Pratt. Next slide, please. This webinar and the remaining educational series, part of the 2022 annual conference programming, have been made possible with the generous support from our sponsors. To the many community sponsors shown here who have been steadfast in supporting the work of PSC Partners, thank you. Next slide. And another huge thank you to the 2022 annual conference corporate sponsors shown here: Gilead, Pliant, High Tide, Miram, Escient, Perspectum, Children's Hospital Colorado, co-hosts Brigham Health and Mass General Brigham, and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Next slide, please. On June 2 to 5, the 18th PSC Partners Annual Conference was held with so much gratitude to our co-sponsors, Dr. Korzenik and Dr. Pratt. The conference exceeded our expectations, and over 500 patients, caregivers, speakers, researchers, and clinicians joined for the launch of the PSC Partners Collaborative Research Network. If you missed it, or if you'd like to rewatch any of the general sessions, all of the videos are available now on the PSC Partners website. Please mark your calendars and join us for the remaining upcoming post-conference educational series of webinars. You will find links to register and dates and titles at the events page of the PSC Partners website. Ricky?
Thank you, Mary. And thank you to everyone for joining us tonight on our first post-conference webinar. Each of our monthly webinars, starting tonight through the end of the year, will focus on a practical topic of interest to PSC patients. We chose diet and nutrition for our first session because we are constantly receiving questions on these issues, and also because this is something that we patients can control. Today, we have 2 excellent speakers who will offer us practical nutritional guidance based on scientific evidence available to date. And after their presentations, there will be a Q&A session. The panelists here tonight are experts in PSC, IBD, diet, and nutrition. We're excited about tonight's presentation, so I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Dan Pratt. Dr. Pratt is Assistant Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School and Director of the Autoimmune and Cholestatic Liver Center at Mass General Hospital. His particular area of clinical interest is autoimmune and cholestatic liver disease, including PSC. Dr. Pratt is the head of the PSC Registry at Mass General, and he also was the medical co-chair for PSC Partners 2022 Annual Conference. So I'll turn it over to you now, Dr. Pratt.
Thank you so much, Ricky, and good evening, everyone. We are happy to see you all here. The PSC Partners team has put together an excellent program this evening, so let's get started. It is a great pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Dr. Jennifer Lai. Dr. Lai has an endowed professorship in liver health and transplantation at the University of California, San Francisco. She is a transplant hepatologist specializing in the care of patients with chronic viral hepatitis, autoimmune disorders, and cirrhosis, particularly those awaiting liver transplantation. She is actively involved in patient-oriented research, including the National Institute of Health-funded Functional Assessment in Liver Transplantation Study. Dr. Lai and her team developed the important Liver Frailty Index to help predict mortality in patients with end-stage liver disease. Dr. Lai received a Grateful Patient Grant to initiate the UCSF PSC research program. We are excited to hear her talk, so I'll turn it over now to Dr. Lai.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pratt, and thank you. I'm so grateful to PSC Partners Seeking a Cure, as well as all of the many individuals who are joining us in the audience today. So I understand that each and every one of you in the audience is here because of your relationship with this beautiful organ, the liver, either because you yourself are living with PSC or connected in some special way to someone who is living with PSC. And you might have been told during your journey with PSC that there are no therapeutics available for PSC and that there's simply nothing that you can do to support your liver or your body. You just have to wait. But I am here to tell you categorically that this is not true. After a decade of experience caring for patients with PSC and other chronic liver diseases, after a decade of experience doing research in managing the liver, I have come to understand that there is an absolutely critical therapeutic available to all of you living with PSC, and that is nutrition. Nutrition is a therapeutic. But as with any pill or any traditional medical therapy where you need to take the right dose at the right time for a long enough period of time, you need to know how to make food work for you and your liver. Now, also, I need to set some expectations here about using nutrition and as a therapeutic and really learning about nutrition as a therapeutic. There are truly so many ways to approach nutrition, and every nutrition educator has a different approach to nutrition. Nutrition as a science is incredibly difficult to study and incredibly difficult to convey to our patients. And so you do need to understand when you're listening to talks about nutrition, when you're reading about nutrition, well, where is this nutrition educator coming from? And so I want to provide you with my own nutrition philosophy. We don't eat specific nutrients. We eat food. And when I'm trying to educate patients about that, I'm going to stay away from, eat this many vitamins, eat this dose of vitamin E or vitamin D, and really go towards more of a general approach to thinking about food. And then the second key philosophy of mine is that the best diet is the one that you will stick to. So yes, there are definitely best practices in nutrition. There are certainly best foods, but honestly, if it's not something that you're going to be able to follow, then it's just not going to be the best diet for you. And so really that's my nutrition philosophy. So with that in mind, I want to go through my objective, and that is to empower individuals, you living with PSC, with liver-focused pragmatic strategies to eating well that are informed by the scientific evidence available to date. So let's begin. So it's very important to understand that the nutritional strategy that you should adopt will really differ by the stage of liver disease. PSC and the biliary strictures related to PSC leads to inflammation of the bile ducts and the liver cells. And it's this inflammation that ultimately leads to fibrosis and scarring of the liver. That ultimately over time will lead to cirrhosis, where the liver cells actually fail to work. During this period of time, at these earlier and even the intermediate stages of inflammation and scarring, the liver function is completely preserved. What I mean by function is that the ability of the liver to clean out all of the toxins, to clear out cholesterol, to produce sugar, to produce all the proteins that it does for you, it's completely preserved all the way through these earlier stages. And it is only when the patient has cirrhosis, when your liver is completely scarred, do we start to see that the function of the liver is impaired. This is such an important concept because the nutritional strategy will shift. At the very beginning, while the liver function is preserved, the strategy to nutrition is about protecting the liver. How can we do no additional harm to the liver? How can we reduce the inflammation that is caused to the liver? And then only when the liver is cirrhotic and not producing its proteins, not doing its function, then the nutritional strategy should shift completely to really just supporting the body's needs because the liver can't. And the reason I spend so much time on this is that the nutritional strategies are not only different, but sometimes they feel actually oppositional. So through this talk, it's important to know when I'm talking about the protect your liver strategy versus supporting your body's needs strategy. So let's begin with protecting your liver. So I could not have said it any better than the food philosopher Michael Pollan, as he said in Defense of Food: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. If that's really all you remember from this talk about living with PSC without cirrhosis, I think this is a great place to start. Now, if we just start with eat food, I did say early on that I wasn't going to give you any specific recommendations, but this one specific, very specific food to eat, it actually has quite a bit of observational data supporting it. And if there's one food that I'm going to recommend that you, or encourage you to at least not stop, that's actually coffee. Coffee at this point has at least a decade of large population-based studies to say that people who do drink coffee actually do experience a decreased liver injury and liver inflammation in the setting of chronic liver diseases. Now, there are some nuances to this coffee because I did not show you a picture of this. I also want to mention that the decaf coffee evidence is slightly not as strong as caffeinated coffee. And along those lines, the evidence for tea, although it's actually helpful, there is more evidence to support that caffeinated tea is also associated with some liver protection and decreased inflammation, decreased fibrosis in the setting of chronic liver diseases. It's just not as strong as this. A beautiful cup of black coffee with caffeine in it. Now, of course, the next obvious question is how much? And it seems like the more coffee, the better. Now, we're not talking about 20 cups a day. It seems that around up to 3 cups of black coffee a day are protective. And then I've seen the studies kind of cap out at 6. Now, when I give this advice to my patients, they ask, well, I don't drink, some of them say, I don't drink coffee. Should I start drinking it? Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say, okay, now you should start drinking coffee. But if you are a coffee drinker, you can continue drinking that coffee. Although if you're not yet a black coffee drinker, I would try to reduce some of that milk and sugar in it and encourage the black coffee. Now, when it comes to the second part of the phrase, not too much, I recommend trying to remember this phrase from Confucius, actually, and it is eat until you are 70% full. This is really just a general strategy to approaching eating. I think that our Western diet has really conditioned us to eat until we're stuffed, until you're kind of, unbuttoning your jeans button, or you're sitting back and kind of in food coma. And that's not the best strategy to protect your liver. Really try to eat until you are only about 70% full, satisfied enough so that your stomach's not growling, but not too much. And so really implementing this strategy is about portion control. How do we know what a good portion is? Well, we all have one of these. And so I'd recommend using the hand guide or the palm guide to approaching portions. So if you take out your hand, take a look, and you'll see the palm here is a good portion size of meat or fish. Now, go ahead and make a fist and just take the tip of your thumb. Let's start thinking about your condiments. This is the peanut butter, the cream cheese, the salad dressing. This is 1 serving size of salad dressing. When it comes to the butter or the oil that you're putting in your pan, let's take your fingertip right here. And then when we're talking about cereal, pasta, rice, vegetables, fruit, go ahead and make a fist. And this is about an approximate serving size for you. And then lastly, when we're talking about some of those carbohydrates, those snacks or nuts or pretzels, then it's kind of a scoop of the palm. So I think you can, obviously this is approximate, but if you're not the type of person, and most of the people I know are not this type of person to sit around with measuring cups and scales to try to measure out serving sizes, this is a really great way to ballpark your serving sizes so that you're not eating too much. It has been shown that actually individuals who do eat sort of too much actually are at increased risk for having fatty liver disease, or what we call non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And they tend to consume about 500 to 600 additional calories per day. Now, why I know that this is a talk on PSC, why am I focusing on fatty liver? And it's because the presence of fat in the liver, which all of us, whether or not we have PSC, are at risk for if we eat too much, if we develop obesity, that is going to be an additional injury to a patient's liver with PSC, and that is inflammation that your liver cannot afford. And so it is so important to try to reduce the portion size, reduce the amount of inflammation that is coming from other causes, which is completely within your control. Another strategy for trying to eat less is more portion control, and also trying to get your belly to feel full before you eat food. This picture really sums it up. First, try to drink a glass of water before your meal, or when your stomach is growling, before you grab, in that ravenous state, before you go to the cupboard or before you go to the supermarket, super hungry, drink a good portion of water to sort of stretch out your stomach and give it the sense that it's actually kind of full. The second is use a really fixed size of a bowl, one with edges on it, because plates tend to, things can overflow on that. And what I would recommend that you do is go to a nice pottery store, go even to the Salvation Army to get some of the kind of the one-piece bowls that people give away because they don't have a matching set. Treat yourself to a really beautiful bowl that is small, something small like that. And this is where you're going to eat most of your meals that you eat by yourself. This is where you're going to put a small portion of rice, or this is where you're going to put your portion of food so that you can control the size of the food that you eat. Anything you snack on should be portioned. Really try to resist grabbing it straight from the bag, because that's when you start losing control of how much you've eaten. So again, another very beautiful small bowl, maybe a small bowl for things like nuts and pretzels and ice cream, and then a maybe medium-sized bowl for your meals. And then if you have a sweet tooth, then I do recommend trying fruit for dessert, or fruit when you have a sweet craving, which are going to be full of nutrients as well as fiber, and still give you that sugar craving, but not have quite as many calories. Now, speaking of sweet and caloric, I am also going to give you one more piece of advice on what to drink, or should I say what not to drink. I really think you should, one strategy to eating less is cutting out the empty calories that come in liquid form. I really recommend reducing the amount of soda, reducing the amount of juice, and reducing even smoothies, even the nutritious smoothies. Smoothies are not particularly nutritious. I would much rather you eat whole fruits. One study has shown that actually individuals who drink added sugar sodas have higher rates of liver fat, higher rates of visceral fat, and higher rates of muscle fat, all of which are very bad for your liver and for your cardiovascular health and for your overall muscle function. If I had to recommend one diet, I would say that the evidence most strongly leans towards a Mediterranean style diet. What is a Mediterranean style diet? A Mediterranean style diet is a plant forward diet. It is rich in vegetables, fruits, dietary fiber. It's actually a high fat diet, not a low fat diet. It's a high fat diet. 30 to 40% of the calories are coming from fats, full of actually the monounsaturated fatty acids, or what we call the healthy fats or omega-3 fatty acids. These are the fats that tend to be liquid at room temperature. And the Mediterranean style diet has been associated with a reduced liver fat. If we get into more specifics here, what does the food pyramid look like in a Mediterranean diet? Well, on a daily basis, you can see here, and I know I'm going to be running out of time, so I'm going to sort of fly through this one, and maybe you can screenshot this this food pyramid. But the key here is that actually that meat is really reduced, as are sweets. Sweets show up in this in the weekly 1 to 2 times per week, and meat shows up about 1 to 4 times per month. So it's really a meat reduction diet. The diet will actually, the plate or the bowl, your special bowl is going to look like predominantly vegetables, and then a very, very small serving of the what we traditionally call the protein, like the meat or the fish. Some strategies for implementing the Mediterranean style diet. I mean, if you want to give a food visual to this is what it would look like. And some strategies I would recommend is take inventory today of how many meals per week you eat meat. And then consider this week replacing meat from one meal this week with a non-meat item. Or try just going one day a week with meatless Mondays. If you already are the type of person who says, well, I only eat meat 3 days a week anyways, on average, then try going down to 2 days a week. It's more of a weaning process. 2 days a week is better than 3 days a week when it comes to eating meat. And then if you're craving a sweet, try fruit as a treat. Now, I will tell you that that rhymes very specifically because my 11-year-old came up with that phrase. And I would, if you're really a sweet person and you really crave sweets, let's just do this 1 day a week. I don't want to deprive you. We're not talking about these dramatic shifts where all of a sudden you go from eating dessert every day to eating, you're going to try to eat fruit every day for the rest of your life. That's not a strategy for success. You really have to sort of wean yourself off of the super sweet desserts. So maybe just 1 day this week, try fruit instead of dessert, instead of a strong, big dessert. Try a new whole grain. So examples of whole grains are brown rice, quinoa, whole wheat bread, oatmeal, bulgur wheat bread. And one strategy for getting yourself accustomed to some of these whole grains, if you're not used to them, is to mix it in with your usual grain. So as you can see, I'm Asian, I'm Chinese, and I eat a ton of white rice. And so when I was trying to get my family transitioning over to brown rice, I tried it initially. I just served my kids brown rice and they revolted and they refused to eat brown rice again. And so we had to sort of cool it for a month. And then what I did was I actually did 75%, our servings were 75% white rice and 25% brown rice. And my kids actually thought, oh, this is not so bad. And then over time, we actually started to increase the amount of the brown rice to white rice ratio. And that was a really good strategy that worked for our Chinese family. So, consider doing that, just slowly transitioning rather than replacing completely. And then in terms of trying to increase the amount of the healthy fats you're eating, I would encourage you to try a plant-based butter instead of a regular butter. Again, transition slowly, maybe use on your bread, you can use a little bit of the plant-based mixed in with the regular butter until you start getting used to this new plant-based butter. Now, I would love in the Q&A if you guys felt like it, if you wanted to sort of declare your intentions about one change that you're going to make this next week, one thing that you're going to try to transition or try to replace, if any of these strategies resonate with you. So let's move to patients with cirrhosis, the nutritional strategy of supporting your body's needs. Now, if I had to come up with a similar phrase to eat food, not too much and mostly plants, what I would say for the patient with PSC and cirrhosis, the phrase would be eat enough of the right stuff at the right time. Let's start with that first phrase of eating enough. Energy needs of a patient with cirrhosis are very high, and the recommended caloric intake for individuals with cirrhosis are shown here. If for patients with normal body weight or slightly overweight, it should be starting at 35 kilocalories per kilogram of body weight per day. And I recommend that you consult with a registered dietitian to measure your resting energy expenditure, or you can actually go online to wellnesstoolbox.ca, a website that was developed by my colleague hepatologist Punita Tandon, to actually calculate your resting energy expenditure, just an estimated amount, so you can get a sense of an even more tailored sense of how many calories that you need. What are some of the things that patients have told me are their barriers to eating enough? Well, the first one is I get full very fast. And so one strategy for that barrier is to eat often, every 3 to 4 hours, and eat high density foods that don't take up a lot of space in the stomach, but are packed with calories, packed with healthy fats. Another barrier is that food tastes different. And what I would recommend is really aim for food variety, that a patient with cirrhosis, as their taste buds are transitioning or they're in and out of hepatic encephalopathy, we're going to have try different foods that maybe you didn't eat all your life, but that actually now are going to taste better or be more palatable. And the last barrier is low salt diet makes my food taste bland. I get it. We have to try to learn to flavor it with other things that are going to hit the tongue with, a lot of tang. That may be garlic, lemon, chili flakes, turmeric, or what we have included in the ASLD practice guidance for malnutrition is actually that in some cases you should talk to your doctor about relaxing the salt restriction if you are completely unable to take in your target caloric and protein needs. Let's talk about protein. Recommended protein intake is 1.2 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. The amount of protein you take in is so critical when you have cirrhosis. Now, one pragmatic tip is that, well, in the United States, we don't actually work in kilograms. We think of things in pounds. And so this translates into 0.5 to 0.8 grams per pound of body weight per day. So here's a pragmatic tip. Take your weight, divide it by 2, which is 0.5 grams, and that is your minimum protein target. So if you are 200 pounds, your protein target should be about 100 grams per day. And if you have been advised to actually lose weight, but you do have PSC and cirrhosis, make sure that you maintain this protein target. You should not reduce your protein target, maintain it, but maintain your protein target while reducing your caloric targets. Now, here's one strategy for protein intake, and that is to take an inventory of everything that you like to eat. Let's just go through a week of all the stuff that you're eating and make a list and look them up online. You only have to do this once, okay? Look it up online and put this up on your refrigerator. Make a list of all these things that are really great sources of protein, maybe 12 to 15 grams or higher per serving, good sources of food and other foods, and then come up with basically sort of a chart that you can just put up on your refrigerator of things that, good things to eat that might have higher amounts of protein. And then once you've done that once, that's up on your fridge, so you just know, what's the protein intake of your typical foods. Now, let's just say, okay, you happen to have an avocado. It has to be eaten today because it's really getting soft. Okay, well, that's in the other food category. Like a half an avocado is 4 grams. Well, now you know if you're going to base your meal around this avocado, you need to choose stuff from the other columns. And so maybe you add some beans, you put some brown rice, and here you go. You're already at 25 grams with this meal. What if I'm really craving white rice today? Well, that's in kind of the low protein category. Pair it up with some tofu, some broccoli. We're almost at 30 grams per day. And then dessert. You have to have your ice cream today. If that's just really, really what you want, well, why don't you just add something from this great sources of protein? Put in a, one of those the scoops, your hand scoop of almonds or pistachios, and you've just made this ice cream snack that was low protein into an almost 20-gram protein snack. This is a great option. Really important point, protein should not be restricted in patients with hepatic encephalopathy. The reason is that patients, a cirrhotic liver has a decreased ability to function and decreased ability to release sugar as a fuel. And therefore, the overall body needs to break down muscle in order to make the heart beat and the brain think and the lungs breathe. And this can lead to malnutrition, muscle loss, and frailty. It has been shown that the metabolic profile of a patient with cirrhosis after an overnight fast is equivalent to the metabolic profile of a healthy person after 3 days of starvation. So in response to that, every hepatologist will be recommending to a patient with cirrhosis that a late evening snack, because a late evening snack has been shown to improve muscle mass, liver function, and quality of life in many, many studies. The ideal snack, one should aim for at least 200 calories and at least 13 grams of protein for the late evening snack to get the most bang for your buck. I'm going to close with some guiding overarching principles. It's so important to know what your personalized needs are. And all you need to do is you need to do this just once. Do this even right now, right after the talk. Go to wellnesstoolbox.ca or go to cirrhosiscare.ca. These are resources developed in Canada to try to calculate your individual calorie and your protein needs to get really specific. And then just do this once. Consider doing a 2-week trial using an online free food log, just so you get an approximate sense of how much fat and fiber and protein are in all of the foods that you typically eat. No nutritional strategy is going to be as good as if you, unless you add exercise. So it's so important to get some daily activity. And the last thing is give yourself grace. We're not looking for major shifts all at once. We're looking for sustainable changes. Aim for one change at a time. Do slow transitions, aim for healthier, not healthy. If we aim for healthy and then all of a sudden we're having ice cream for dessert, that can feel so discouraging. But really, if you just had fruit one day a week instead of the ice cream for dessert, you're doing so much better. And so make sure you celebrate those successes when you do make those changes successfully. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lai. That was a remarkably helpful talk, and I know the audience has really enjoyed it, and we'll have some real good questions for you at the end. So thank you very much. And we'll move on now to our next speaker, and I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Joshua Korzenik. And Dr. Korzenik is the director of the Resnick Family Research Center for PSC, the director of the Crohn's and Colitis Center. Both of those are at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, and an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Korzenik's research is focused on developing new therapies for PSC based on a better understanding of the PSC and IBD connection. He serves as the research lead for PSC Partners Chan Zuckerberg Rare as One grant, and as many of you know, he was the medical co-chair for the 2022 PSC Partners Annual Conference. And we are very happy to have Dr. Korzenik presenting this evening. So I'll hand it off to you, Josh.
Thank you, Dan, very much. And thank you, Jennifer. That was really wonderful, and delighted to be here, and delighted also that while I think Jennifer gave a phenomenal overview and background, that there's not too much overlap. And one of the reasons why there won't be too much overlap is that my orientation is from inflammatory bowel disease and trying to apply what we know there to PSC. And the challenge is, what do we really know about nutrition, and how do we make sense of the data that we have? So you'll see it's a little bit more, it's a slightly different take. And then at the end, I'll discuss the recent results of a small pilot trial we did of 2 different dietary interventions in PSC, And we can talk about that and answer questions at the end. So I'll try to be concise and move quickly. I'll pause it a number of times to go into a little bit more detail on some issues. And some of this, though, I would say is, let's say, perhaps a little redundant in a slight way. Next. So somewhat, as Jennifer pointed out, what Michael Pollan said is eat food and eat food regularly. And we would say that diet in PSC and in IBD is fundamentally important, but we don't know how. We can define a bad diet, and we know what probably can do some deleterious things. We know broadly what a good diet would be, but we don't know some of the details of how does that apply more specifically to inflammatory bowel disease or PSC. And I'd say here that when we discuss some of the dietary information we know in ulcerative colitis or Crohn's, it's hard to know how do we apply that to PSC. We're really trying very hard to understand the relationship between ulcerative colitis and PSC, between Crohn's and PSC. And the question then is, can we distinguish a therapeutic diet for ulcerative colitis or one for Crohn's or one for PSC? Or is it really within that, everyone really might need different types of diets with variations? Oh, next. So what do we mean when we say food is therapy? Next. We mean a variety of things. One is first to really minimize malnutrition. We want to address any micro or macronutrient deficiency. There can be an important effect on immune function, which may be critical in trying to improve inflammation, whether it's IBD or PSC. One important thing that may be relevant to all these diseases is the intestinal barrier function. How do we improve that? There's also, as Jennifer pointed out, the psychological benefit of active involvement in your own care and taking matters into your own hands and trying to improve your care. And then there's things which we're just trying to really dissect out, which is influence on the microbiome and how the gut bacteria and perhaps the bacteria in the biliary tree also influences what happens with these diseases. Next, please. So what is known about diet and PSC specifically? What has been studied and what is the data out there? And unfortunately, it's very little, and we're trying to work on that. So that there was a study back in 2011 looking at a gluten-free diet in PSC in just a very small number of patients. It was in other patients as well with autoimmune liver disease, in part because some of the similarities that can happen in liver disease in people with celiac disease, even though it seems to be a very different process. And in those small number of patients, there was no benefit. There was a survey of about 1,000 PSC patients done at a number of centers. And this was done in comparison to about 650 or so healthy individuals without PSC, without IBD. Now, it's hard to make conclusions here. These weren't standardized scales, and the conclusions are kind of contradictory and relatively minor, but those people with PSC compared to healthy controls were less likely to eat fish and less likely to eat grilled barbecue or meat. People with PSC were more likely to consume steak or hamburgers that were well done, or more well done. Now, there are things that could be considered problems in people who eat sort of very well done or charcoaled kind of steaks and burgers, but it's hard to really make much of this. It's hard to know what to do this, and this isn't certainly necessarily actionable intelligence, meaning you should look at this and say, oh, I better eat more fish. Now, it may be a good idea, and we'll look at some of that data, but from here on in the talk until we get to the clinical trial, we're really going to rely mostly on data from inflammatory bowel disease, which may give us some clues. So really trying to look at what is the state of the art. It's inadequate, but we'll go over some of the data. Next, please. So malnutrition is the very first task. We want to assess malnutrition, and in IBD, the rates are variable, ranging from 20 to 85%. In this largest published series, in Crohn's disease, they detected malnutrition in about 6%, and those people had an increased length of stay and mortality. And certainly, as Jennifer mentioned, we do worry about malnutrition particularly in people with cirrhosis, and trying to counter that as best we can with food. And there's a very simple screening tool that can be used to assess that we really all should be familiar with, and how to do that. But then we look really at some of the macro and micronutrients. So macro and nutrients mean proteins, carbohydrates, fats, and micronutrients mean things like vitamins and minerals. And so when we look, and next, in people with inflammatory bowel disease, we worry about growth and we worry about low albumin, which can also happen in cirrhosis independent of nutrition. But we worry about, you can see here, some of the surveys in IBD that people can be deficient in, whether it's zinc is a common problem, magnesium, and then you see the other ones here as well. And so we are very, we encourage everyone to be very attuned to checking in on these. And even if somebody feels relatively well, these things should be monitored intermittently. There's a big focus, particularly on vitamin D, and we'll go into some of the reasons why. Next, please. Next slide, please. There we go. So vitamin D is very important. It may have an impact in terms of PSC, and people are looking at whether there may be a therapeutic impact on vitamin D, even within the normal range, but is higher better. And there's some data to support that in PSC. But in the Nurses' Health Study, so this is a study of about 80,000 nurses followed over many decades. And so looking at people and looking at levels or other things, particularly their intake prior to the development of these diseases. We don't have this for people with PSC because PSC is relatively uncommon. And if you're only looking at about 80,000 nurses, that's a big number for a study, but there are not going to be many with PSC. Now, the people who had the highest amount of vitamin D intake had a markedly reduced risk of subsequently developing Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. This was not seen in a similar European study, but it's interesting that even in a study, though it was not quite statistically significant, in people who had normal vitamin D levels, but they were supplemented, those who had the higher amounts did better in a placebo-controlled trial than those who had lower amounts, even though they were all within the normal range. So some suggestion there may be a therapeutic benefit, and this is being explored more now in PSC. Next, please. So many of us have heard and read about omega-3 and fish oil. This is very interesting. There's some data that looks promising in ulcerative colitis and Crohn's, and there was a study back in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1996 where it looked like this would be great. So this is taking people in remission, and half of a relatively small study got fish oil, half got placebo, and those who got the placebo had a 70% chance of flaring compared to 28 who got the fish oil. Now, the problem here is the placebo used something called caprylic acid, which may actually induce a flare. They didn't know that at the time, but that's one thought. So two much larger studies were done in Crohn's using a particular type of omega-3 at a pretty hefty dose. And when they looked at this, same thing, people in remission, was there a difference? Well, in both EPIC 1 study and EPIC 2, there was no difference in terms of outcomes. The difference between 31 to 35% flare rate was not statistically significant, and obviously the difference in the EPIC 2 wasn't. So we still think there may be some differences despite this, and it may be in ulcerative colitis, and it may be even in PSC, but we just don't have that data yet. Next, please. So when we look at diet, how do we understand the link to a global increase in IBD? And when we look at places like India, China, that didn't used to have IBD, and now they do, and in their wake, then they have PSC. It's interesting that when we look at studies of vegetable intake, and the higher vegetable intake is associated with a lower risk of ulcerative colitis, though that was not seen in Crohn's, and it wasn't seen in Asia. Now, why that is and what the other factors are aren't clear. Higher consumption of fruit was associated with a lower risk of ulcerative colitis, but just barely, and more strongly in Crohn's disease. Next, please. So what else can we say about dietary risk factors? We know breastfeeding can be protective against the development of ulcerative colitis or Crohn's as an infant. It probably sort of sets the intestinal bacteria on a certain pathway of healthier bacteria. It's not, there's N3s, or the fish oils, and then N6s can be some of the fatty acids that's more in red meat. And that may be a risk factor for worsening disease. Fast foods in one small study a long time ago suggested that's an increased risk. And it's probably more of a broader insight into what the person's eating than particularly fatty foods. Coffee, as we heard, can be protective, and a very large study recently came out suggesting that all-cause mortality is reduced in coffee drinkers, whether it's decaf or caffeinated. But as Jennifer pointed out, the data is better for caffeine, but it may be that there's something called polyphenols that's in coffee and in other foods as well that may be one part of the benefit. And importantly here, to jump ahead a little bit, is that in an important study that I'll talk about shortly, is that people who took in more meat, more processed meat, and increased sulfur intake and alcohol as well were associated more with flares. Obesity itself was not associated with a flare of IBD. Next. Now, the fiber and carbohydrates are really interesting because in a study done in England of dietary records from England in 1815, it found that people took in about 15 pounds per capita of sugar. This is looking retrospectively. They weren't, they had very close dietary records and they could sort that out. So 15 pounds per capita over the course of a year. In the year 2000, so over the last 200 years, that's increased to between 150 and 200 pounds per capita. So in the United States. So that's really a stunning increase. Is that associated with a problem? Well, we don't really know because the baseline, or even when we look at, say, the lowest quarter or lowest fifth, it's still so much higher than what it used to be. But still, there seems to be an increase in refined sugar and inflammatory bowel disease. It may not be the sugar itself, it may be, but it may be also that there's reduced fiber intake and increased complex carbohydrates, which we'll talk about shortly as well. And then when we look at the Nurses' Health Study, when they looked at cases of Crohn's and ulcerative colitis that happened after the dietary records, they found that in Crohn's disease, there was a significant risk reduction. So the reduction in the risk of developing Crohn's subsequently from increase in fruit fiber. So fiber from cereals, which many of us take in, whether it's whole grains or others, didn't modify that risk. And that increased risk was not associated, or that decreased risk with the fruit fiber was not seen in ulcerative colitis. So it may be less relevant than to ulcerative colitis, as most people with PSC, as you know, have ulcerative colitis. Next. So I'm going to try to race through this a little bit because I want to get to the clinical trial. This is the study that I talked about. 191 people followed for a year, 52% relapsed, and it was meat consumption, red meat in particular, and processed meat. And that goes along with sulfur intake, and we'll talk about that shortly, and alcohol intake. Next, please. We tried to replicate that. We had a higher number of people. Next slide, please. In our baseline, and we had more of a homogeneous population just on mesalamine. We got food frequency questionnaires, which detail roughly what people take over the course of a year. And only 11%, so 45 relapsed. We did not see an association with sulfur, meat, or carbohydrate intake. And we found these fatty acids were associated with an increased risk of a flare. And particularly this myristic we felt more confident in, even though the odds ratio was greater for this linoleic fatty acid. And that this myristic acid can be seen in dairy, it can be seen in coconuts. Again, I wouldn't make a dietary change based on this unless you're taking a phenomenal amount of coconut in. Next, please. Everyone is interested and curious about gluten. And for the most part, we haven't seen a difference, but in this survey here, as much as 2/3 of people who went on a gluten-free diet described improvement of their symptoms. It doesn't mean necessarily that there was an anti-inflammatory effect, and I wouldn't recommend it on the basis of this, but some people reported fewer or less severe flares, and whether that's an inkling of something, and whether it actually has to do with something called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth isn't clear. Next, please. So I want to take just a brief moment because I think this may be important for inflammatory bowel disease and ultimately may be very important for the liver. When we look at complex carbohydrates, complex carbohydrates are not digested in the small bowel. They get digested in the colon. In our diet, we probably get in 3 to 7% of our calories in the Western diet is actually absorbed through our colon. What happens is that we don't digest these complex carbohydrates. They get broken down by the bacteria in the colon into something called butyrate, or short-chain fatty acids. Those short-chain fatty acids are the primary fuel for colonocytes, and they probably have a very important impact on liver health as well. So that we take in our typical Western diet perhaps 10 grams of fiber. The American Heart Association recommends perhaps 35 grams of fiber. Well, what did we take in? Not the paleo nutrition, the diet, the fad diet, but this is what did people eat 10 to 12,000 years ago before we became farmers. And they estimate it may have been between 60 and 120 grams of complex carbohydrates a day. And the lowland gorilla probably does this and takes in and absorbs through their colon, which we don't usually think of the colon as a nutritional organ, as much as 57% of their calories from this colonic fermentation. What that means is there would be a radically different environment in the colon, and there would be an important influence on the intestinal microbiome because those bacteria that thrive on this complex carbohydrates would be much higher. So that's an important impact because we think all of these things would be important. Now, we didn't develop IBD or PSC 10, 12,000 years ago when we changed, but much more recently, really in the last 100 years or so. So there are other factors, but it may be we've gotten to a certain threshold that these things have become important. Next, please. Dietary intervention. So I'm going to race through this quickly because I want to get to the PSC trial. Next. Looking at the specific carbohydrate diet, which we're going to talk about more. This is a particular diet where it restricts the amount of complex carbohydrates, more simple carbohydrates, and there's data to suggest that it may be beneficial, particularly in Crohn's, but possibly in ulcerative colitis. And there's been 1 or 2 case reports out there for patients with PSC. It's a fairly restrictive diet. It's very difficult for some people to follow, but it's out there and many people with IBD use it and report a benefit. Next, please. The best study that's been done in IBD was a study done in Crohn's by a friend, Jim Lewis, where they took almost 200 people and randomized them to either the Mediterranean diet or the specific carbohydrate diet for Crohn's. And you can see here that about 40% in each, a little bit more than 40, 45%, felt that they had symptomatic remission. Now, only about a third had a response reduction in their fecal calprotectin, a marker in stool of inflammation. And when they looked at CRP, a marker of inflammation in the blood, only about 3%, 5% had a reduction in that. So there certainly seems to be a clinical benefit, maybe an anti-inflammatory benefit in some, but it really wasn't a rousing success in certain ways. Next. So we're very interested in diet. We're doing a variety of studies in diet, some of which we've been collaborating closely with PSC partners and probably many of you filling out food frequency questionnaires. And we're just in the midst of doing that study now, comparing, or doing the analysis now, comparing people with ulcerative colitis, Crohn's, and PSC to healthy controls. But we wanted to do an interventional study. This is I think perhaps the first interventional study done in PSC looking at diet. And we wanted to use a vegan low sulfur diet, and I'll explain why in a second, and compare it to the specific carbohydrate diet. Our hypothesis, next please, is that there's an important connection between nutrition, the microbiome, bile acids, and PSC. We wanted to look at these 2 diets because of the suggestion in IBD that there may be a benefit, and because our own hypothesis that we're working on that low sulfur, low protein diets may be helpful in ulcerative colitis and PSC. Next. Now, we took this study using this SCD. This was first introduced in 1924, gained popularity with this book called Breaking the Fish's Cycle, where she was treating her daughter for ulcerative colitis. And as I mentioned, the SCD excludes certain carbohydrates, disaccharides, or more complex carbohydrates, and really tries to replace it with monosaccharides with the idea they're trying to starve the microbiome, something that's hard to do, but that's the fundamental hypothesis. Next, please. We hypothesize that there's something called hydrogen sulfide, which in the body can be beneficial, but in the gut or in the biliary tree may be damaging. It can impair mitochondrial function, the sort of power sources of the cells. It reduces uptake of butyrate, this primary fuel source for the gut and perhaps the biliary tree, and enables sort of production of other toxins, which may be important. In particular, also sulfated bile acids, and particularly a taurine conjugated, may be increased in PSC. And these are precursors for this hydrogen sulfide. So hydrogen sulfide is what makes rotten eggs stink. It's what makes your eyes water when you're cutting an onion, and may do all sorts of beneficial things, again, in the body, but in the lumen and elsewhere may not be so beneficial. So we wanted to see if we can reduce hydrogen sulfide in bile or in the colon by giving a very low protein diet. Now, it's still within the range of what we would expect, and what Jennifer was pointing out was at least 0.5 milligrams or grams per kilogram, and it was within that range, but it was reducing people's protein intake, and these weren't people with cirrhosis, but in people with PSC and with an elevated alkaline phosphatase. Next. Now, we were doing this with instructions. We weren't giving people the food, and we had dietitians working closely with everybody, giving a suggestion of what's allowed and what's not allowed in each of these diets, and meeting with them on a weekly basis to try to give them information. Next. We had really three aims. One was to determine the impact of the SCD and the low sulfur vegan diet on the intestinal microbiome. We wanted to evaluate SCD on serum and fecal bile acids. And then we wanted to assess the potential clinical efficacy of the dietary intervention. Now, frankly, we did not expect to see a difference in alkaline phosphatase. We were really looking to see, is there a change in the microbiome and in fecal bile acids? But we wanted to look at alkaline phosphatase as well, as that's sort of, as you know, an endpoint for many clinical trials. Next. We took 20 PSC patients. We randomized them to either one of the diets. They needed to have an alkaline phosphatase greater than 1.5 times the upper limits of normal. And we did this also decentralized. So someone could essentially do this almost anywhere in the country. Patients were also recruited from the Brigham, from Mass General with Dan, and from UC Davis with Chris Bolus, and through the very helpful assistance of the PSC partners. Next. People had a food diet for 2 weeks. They had then randomized for 8 weeks, and then they could follow up after that as they wanted, but we wanted to see how well people could follow the diet after we stopped. Next, please. These were roughly the patient characteristics. Next. And what was amazing to us is actually we did show a difference, and a statistical difference, in terms of the alkaline phosphatase. So about 3 out of 10 had a reduction in the alkaline phosphatase on the lower protein diet, averaging from about 9% to 40%. After 8 weeks here, you can see they stopped the diet and it started to come back up, or they could continue if they wanted. And those who went on the higher protein diet, it was about 3 out of 10 had an increase. Only 3 out of the 10 had a decrease, in a relatively small one. Next. You can see here that there was a similar reduction in the liver enzymes in the two groups, looking at AST and ALT. Next. And this really correlated with protein intake. So we had dietary records, and in the low protein, low sulfur diet, there was a lower intake of proteins. It was still above that threshold that Jennifer mentioned. And in the specific carbohydrate, which is more reliant on proteins, their protein intake went up. It was not, there was no significant differences in carbohydrate or fat consumption. And we think the differences seem to be mostly correlated with protein intake. Next, please. So it's small. It's exciting because maybe it points a way to understanding things better. We're pursuing this avenue of looking to see whether hydrogen sulfide may be the culprit behind what happens in primary sclerosing cholangitis. And we'll be doing a study starting hopefully in about 5 to 6 months where we're actually giving a scavenger of hydrogen sulfide to see if we can improve PSC that way. The alkaline phosphatase improvement in particular seems to be driven by the lower protein intake. The differences were modest, but this is the first study and a very small study. We were amazed that we could show a difference in this. Our next step is to take people in that trial who provided us stool samples along the way, and we've already sent off those for analysis, and then we're going to be doing to understand both the metabolites in there as well as the changes in the microbiome. We hope to have those within the next 6 months. It's hard to recommend this diet at this point because certainly protein intake is important and we don't want people to drive it too low. And also these are very preliminary, small numbers. Can we rely on this? But it also points the way that diet may be very important in liver health, as Jennifer pointed out. So we aim to understand this, how it relates to PSC, and how we can optimize the benefits of diet in PSC. So thank you very much for your attention. Some of it's a little rushed and I apologize for that, but we look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Josh. That was terrific. And and I see Jennifer's already on. Jennifer has been busy answering questions, but I think some of those are worthy of bringing out to the whole group too, Jennifer. And I hope you don't mind answering them live as well. But we have a bunch of questions here. So I'm going to jump right in and ask Jennifer that one of the attendees asked that one of the slides I've seen from Mayo says to make sure you eat protein at every meal. So can you reconcile that with eating mostly plants? And I guess the bigger question is, can we get enough bang for our protein buck eating mostly plants?
I love this question. Thanks for bringing it up. But first of all, Josh, that was such a great talk, full of great data. So thanks for that. I love this question because I think it goes at the heart of this myth that in order to get protein in your diet, you have to eat meat. And if you actually did that study, if you do this little food study, just sit down and look at all the foods that you ate, even just do it to, what did you eat over the last 3 days? And then just search, use a search engine and look at how much protein is in each food. You'd actually see that there's protein in everything. Now, of course, yes, meat is a very efficient way of getting protein, but there are lots of foods in the plant-based diet that contain protein, many of which I put into that answer, such as beans and chickpeas and tofu. So there's actually a lot of protein in plant foods. And so one can definitely get your recommended protein needs on a plant-based diet.
Terrific. Thank you, Jennifer. And Josh, let me ask this question because you gave us a lot of wonderful data there. And I think trying to reconcile that data with what is the best for the patient comes in. And I know Jennifer gave us a lot of really practical advice. But is there truly a special diet for PSC, for IBD, and for our patients with both that our audience could really hold on to? Because, and I'll mention that some of the other specific questions that came up related to this is one of our attendees asked that should I be cooking something different for my eight-year-old son with PSC than the rest of the family? And one other one was, can specific diets improve symptoms of PSC and IBD? And also that critical question you were addressing, can they improve disease outcomes?
So really important questions. And I'd say that what we are doing is sort of trying to develop data to be able to come up with specific recommendations. But I would say at this point, it's difficult too, but we eat on a regular basis. And so we need to come up with some guidance of what should we do in the absence of more specific data. So certainly Jennifer pointed out to a number of pathways that are really important. And what we tend to do in our clinic is we sort of encourage people to do, let's say, guided experimentation, meaning try something. It may be small steps, as Jennifer's suggesting. Some people want to throw themselves into it. We see them as you can take small steps, or there's also 2 large, let's say, poles. One is something more along the lines of the specific carbohydrate diet. And this little study we did is not a definitive refutation or saying that it's bad for you. We don't know. And so it's worth not just trying something for a day or for a week, but working with somebody who can help guide you. Do that in a directed, focused way for a period of time, and perhaps follow your alkaline phosphatase, follow other things, see how you feel. If that works or doesn't work, great, stay with it. If not, try something that's different, whether it's something more along the lines of a plant-based diet or even further, a vegan diet, and see, it depends on how much effort, time, interest you have. Many of us, life is busy and it's sometimes very hard to devote too much time to this, and it may be small steps are easier, and something like the specific carbohydrate diet takes a tremendous amount of time and effort. But there's some ways of getting at some of the heart of that and trying that kind of guided experimentation.
Fantastic. Thanks, Josh. And Jennifer, I'm going to direct this next one to you. There were several questions that came up in the chat regarding the role for intermittent fasting in PSC and IBD. And intermittent fasting has gained a fair amount of popularity, so we'd love to hear you address that.
Yes, so I'm going to just comment from the PSC side, as I don't manage patients with IBD specifically for their IBD. For patients with cirrhosis and PSC and cirrhosis, I strongly advise against intermittent fasting. The cirrhotic liver is not able to make enough protein. These long periods of prolonged fasting are extremely dangerous for the body. So if you have cirrhosis, I strongly advise against intermittent fasting. For everyone without cirrhosis, but with PSC in the earlier stages, there is no data to my knowledge that supports that is in favor of intermittent fasting to improve any biochemical markers of PSC or any clinical events related to PSC. That being said, when we look at intermittent fasting for patients with fatty liver disease, for example, can be an effective strategy to sort of moderate dietary intake if you respond to that. But the data suggests that intermittent fasting is not better than other diets in which your caloric intake is restricted. And so similar to Josh's response of, really just try it out. If you're the kind of person who has a hard time controlling your caloric intake with other dietary strategies, but intermittent fasting works for you, then that may actually be the best diet for you. But again, if you have cirrhosis or really advanced fibrosis, I strongly advise against it. And if you do, for all of you with PSC who are thinking about trying intermittent fasting, first touch base with your gastroenterologist or your hepatologist to make sure you have a very accurate fibrosis assessment and make sure that they are okay with you trying it.
Perfect. Thanks, Jennifer. And Josh, quickly, anything in IBD and intermittent fasting?
So it seems that there may be a benefit in Crohn's, but it's really more relying on the idea of with Crohn's, we do sometimes what's called bowel rest, and people will even be put on intravenous nutrition, or we put people on an elemental diet where the nutrition is absorbed very high up. For ulcerative colitis, that may be even detrimental. Intermittent fasting is different in ulcerative colitis, but really more absolute fasting may be deleterious because there's this issue of butyrate, this short chain fatty acid that I mentioned, that is the primary fuel for the lining of the colon. So again, there's a lot of interest. Some people feel it better. It may be, is it that you're having intermittent fasting, or is it that you're not taking in certain foods that may not be the best thing? If intermittent fasting means you're taking in less cheese doodles, now occasionally I love to have a little bag of cheese doodles, but that may not be the best thing for you. And is it that, or is it the intermittent fasting? I would say I wouldn't advocate it for ulcerative colitis, and for Crohn's. The jury's out, but it's very interesting because the body does respond in a fed state and in an unfed state. And there's hormonal cycles and other things that we've disrupted by our more or less continuous grazing. For someone with cirrhosis, that grazing is important. For someone with ulcerative colitis, it's not clear. Someone with Crohn's, that may not be as good. And so there's some preliminary data that it may be helpful.
Interesting. And Josh, I'm going to stick with you for a moment. There were actually a couple questions related to the microbiome. And so the questions specifically are is there an advantage to taking probiotics for either PSC or IBD? And then the second question was, can you address probiotics for PSC/Crohn's patients? And when is the best time of day to consume these if you're going to?
So a really important question, and I think we all are enamored of the concept of probiotics. Can we somehow manipulate the gut microbiome? And isn't that the source of the problem? And I think we're not there yet. I mean, we had done a study, myself, Jessica Allegretti, one of my compatriots, of a very small study of fecal transplant, which is sort of massive amounts of a sort of probiotic, let's call it that, to try to improve PSC. And it was in the early days, it really didn't do that much. Maybe 3 patients got slightly better out of 10. But the issue is there a probiotic you can get and take over the counter? Because they're all over the counter at this point. And no, there isn't any good data at this point. Having said that, we're all very, very interested in the microbiome. Working with Dan and others, we've sent off just recently several hundred samples, about 600 samples of different samples of the microbiome, where we're looking to understand what are they doing, how are they acting, what's the difference between PSC and IBD. And we hope over the next year to be able to have this huge database to analyze and understand and help them guide what are the right probiotics to take. There's a tremendous amount of interest. There are literally billions and billions of dollars being put into this. So I do think in the not too distant future, we will have genuinely effective probiotics, but we're not there yet. And the ones that you take over the counter, I don't have not been shown to have any significant benefit.
Terrific. Thanks, Josh. And Jennifer, I'm going to come to you now for all the questions regarding coffee. Everyone's excited about coffee. And the big question is, do they have to drink it black? Do you still get the benefit? You had mentioned black coffee specifically. Others were asking, can you put in oat milk? Is the benefit lost with some of these additives that might make it a little more palatable for people?
First, I completely empathize because I used to drink my coffee like melted coffee ice cream. One can actually train. You can actually transition yourself off of it. Not, don't go completely with black coffee, but use a little bit less sugar, use a little bit less milk. So it is possible. The other short answer is that we don't really know. I mean, as you heard from even Josh's talk, we don't actually know what it is about coffee. Is it the caffeine? Is it these other things in coffee that are actually protective? We just have enough observational data to show that it is protective. So I don't, although the most of the studies are showing that people who drink black coffee, who are in the habit of drinking a lot of black coffee, tend to have reduced levels of liver inflammation and fibrosis in the setting of chronic liver diseases. So, the evidence does support the black coffee. Kind of scientifically, it's okay to add sugar. It's not like the sugar makes the coffee bad or the milk makes the coffee bad. It's just that, be aware that that extra milk, that extra sugar is added sugar. Added sugar is definitely bad for the liver, causes fatty liver. That milk is going to be added calories. So that's just going to add up to your total caloric intake, leading to obesity, increased risk for metabolic syndrome, and then increased risk of fatty liver disease. So it's not so much that you absolutely, like, if you drink any drop of milk in your black coffee, you basically eliminate the effects. But as much as possible, do be aware of the calories you're taking in with the coffee. And if you can transition yourself to, pure black coffee, that's preferable.
Terrific. Thanks, Jennifer. And Josh, I'm going to give you this one, is that even though there may not be a specific PSC diet, the question was, are there any foods or supplements that even in theory could be beneficial to PSC and PSC/IBD patients?
Yeah, well, I'd be interested in Jennifer's opinion as well. I would say that certainly there is a suggestion of vitamin D, and that should be closely monitored. Fish oil, I think the jury's out, but the preponderance of the data would not suggest a benefit, but we don't know. Curcumin was studied in a small study out of Mayo, I think, and didn't show really, I think about 20% or so had some benefit. So really not anything all that overwhelming, even though in ulcerative colitis, there was a very good study that did show a significant benefit at a reasonable dose, about 1.5 grams twice a day of curcumin, so a sub-fraction of turmeric. Are there other micronutrients or sort of other supplements that may be of benefit? At this point, I think we're pretty limited. I think it's important to make sure that you're not deficient in a particular mineral or vitamin, and those should be measured on a regular basis. And we measure in particular vitamin D. We'll measure zinc every once in a while, and certainly in somebody who's got more significant cirrhosis, there are other concerns there.
Yeah. Well, let me ask Jennifer. Jennifer, in that same vein, how do you talk to your patients about the use of supplements that may be lacking in any data, but yet they find information available on the internet and elsewhere that may suggest a benefit?
I absolutely agree with Josh's selection of supplements. Those are the ones that certainly come up, and those are the ones that I definitely engage with my patients about: the vitamin D, the curcumin. I think that the mouse data, the non-human data around vitamin D and the curcumin and omega-3 fatty acids are really compelling. I think that the problem with translating it to humans and to people is that we can't take enough. So at least, for example, for both the omega-3 fatty acids and for the curcumin, that if we could get high enough doses into us, it would almost certainly, I believe that it would show a benefit. We just can't take enough. The curcumin dose, it has to be so high to get any detectable amount in your any detectable measurable amount. And so that's really the challenge, is that sure, theoretically and in mouse models, there is very likely protective benefit for the liver. It's just translating it into humans and doing it in a pragmatic way is where we're lacking. And so what I tell my patients who are very interested in taking these supplements and have decided it really helps them is that I'm okay with those three, actually: vitamin D, omega-3, and curcumin. They just have to let me know so that we can monitor their liver tests while they take them and make sure that they're not getting any, hepatotoxicity from the supplements.
Terrific. Thanks so much. Josh, there's a question here actually related to, and I'll give this to you because of the research you've already started, but how do we measure the impact of foods and diets on PSC? Now, you've shown a little bit about alkaline phosphatase, but ultimately, what is going to be the marker of proof that these diets actually are beneficial?
Right. I think it's a really important question, and it relates not just to food, but even new therapies, new medical medications that we're studying, because as we know, there is some importance certainly in alkaline phosphatase, but it only goes so far, and you can reduce alkaline phosphatase, but it doesn't necessarily, it can, but it doesn't necessarily translate to remission of the disease. There can still be progression of disease when alkaline phosphatase is normal or even low. And so we don't have a good way of doing that. That's part of what our research is engaged in, and other people around the country and around the world, of trying to find better biomarkers, which is so critical. And that's what PSC Partners is also engaged in, is trying to develop a better initiative to do that, because we want to find something that's better, that really reflects what's going on. There are things that have been looked at, like what we looked at in the stool, which I mentioned, this calprotectin. You can look in bile, and that seems to correlate with inflammation, but you're not going to be collecting bile on a routine basis. And so I would say we don't have the ideal biomarker. We have these indirect biomarkers of activity, like alkaline phosphatase and liver enzymes, and it's a work in progress. So we desperately need something. So if we could do a study that just lasted 8 weeks and measure the response to a different biomarker, and it showed a big response, then we would be thrilled, and we could shortcut a lot of the trials rather than needing to do a study for 2 or 3 years to say, is this going to have a broader impact? So really, it's a critical point of research for PSC.
Fantastic. Thanks, Josh. And Jennifer, let me ask you, since we saw some data showing that these patients, PSC, we know well with the fat soluble vitamins, and Josh showed a nice slide showing a number of potential deficiencies in IBD. Someone asked, what vitamins should I be taking on a regular basis? And they asked, what is the best time? And is there various forms of vitamins that are better than others? One person specifically submitted a reference to an article that talked about a specific type of vitamin D as perhaps being better than others. So maybe I'll throw this to both of you and ask within each field, you know, what is the best advice for your patients in regards to vitamin supplementation?
Tricky question. Josh, I'll let you go first.
Okay, so I don't know about the sort of nano vitamin D supplementation. I would say that certainly vitamin D3 seems to be better than D2 in terms of absorption. There's even suggestions of that form may be more beneficial and D2 may not be. I'd say that probably taking it with a meal may be more important, but it's not clear, so that it gets better absorbed in terms of being fat soluble. And so in terms of timing, I wouldn't say that I'm aware of whether it's in the morning or in the evening as much as taking and monitoring it with some food. In terms of that particular article, I appreciate someone putting it there and I'll take a look, but I'm not familiar with it.
My answer is really going to go to one of my first slides, which is about my nutrition philosophy. I really feel like we eat food and not nutrients. And so I tend to, my personal approach with my patients is to tend to get away from thinking about specific nutrients and really focusing more on a general holistic approach to eating. Vitamin D and fats, fat soluble vitamins are in really great foods that one should eat. Fish, eggs, the really good, if you eat the rainbow, you're going to be getting a lot of the good nutrients for the most part. We have a limited amount of time in our lives to really focus on specific nutrients. So I think that for the vast majority of individuals living with PSC, one cannot go wrong by approaching nutrition in terms of good foods and eating the rainbow and eating a diverse diet. And most likely you'll be getting a sufficient amount of nutrients. That's my personal approach.
Terrific. Let me just follow up with that quickly with another question that was asked, Jennifer, regarding specific foods that prevent the bone loss that may come with PSC.
I actually think that there is the standard, obviously calcium and vitamin D are absolutely critical. You do need to be consuming a sufficient amount of that, but there is no substitute for good weight bearing exercise. You can take in as much calcium and vitamin D as you want, but if you're not stressing your bones a little bit to stimulate the hormones needed to rebuild and strengthen the bone structure, then you're still going to suffer from osteoporosis. So for the osteoporosis question, I would say really focus on getting good weight bearing exercise, 150 minutes per week. And that's going to be one of the best ways to prevent osteoporosis.
Terrific. Thanks. Thanks, Jennifer. Josh, can I ask you a question that was asked, and I hear a lot, is can avoiding foods with additives and processed foods be helpful, even if we don't really know what those PSC triggers are? So
yeah, so it's really important, and it's interesting because certainly in the IBD world and ulcerative colitis, there's some thought that there's certain emulsifiers that have been looked at in both animal studies and to a limited extent in people that may have an impact, that may cause an increase in flares. So they may be barrier breakers, they may get rid of some of the mucin, they may do other things. So we are exposed to so much that certainly a sort of cleaner whole food kind of diet is better. Now, when you start getting into this, it can be a little bit terrifying because there's so many chemicals out there, and they look in the urine or in the blood, and we walk around with so much in our bodies. Much of that we can't really get rid of, but we can by trying to eat a sort of cleaner diet. Now, is that going to have an impact? many of these things we don't know about. Many of these things haven't been studied, but I'd say that it's reasonable, but it's hard to be sort of make that as a really strong recommendation because we just don't know.
Okay.
I agree with you, Josh, on that. It can be so overwhelming to handle this kind of avoid processed foods. So if we're going to prioritize things that we're supposed to avoid, I might recommend from a pragmatic perspective, the one thing is the added sugar. If we're going to focus on, and that actually naturally will get you out of processed foods, but it's very clear from mouse models and an emerging body of human data that it's the added sugars, the high fructose corn syrup, that's the stuff that is really making the liver, it's adding to the liver inflammation. Now, whether it's going to improve PSC markers, it might not, but it certainly is going to contribute. Those added sugars do contribute to liver inflammation, which can lead to accelerated fibrosis and development of cirrhosis. So if one is going to focus on one thing, it might be added sugars that kind of brings you more towards a whole fresher diet.
I think it's a great point, particularly because it sort of fits into the category of we don't necessarily know what's good, but we do know to some extent what's bad and what stresses the liver. And so I think that's a really important point.
All right, Jennifer, I'll put you on the spot with the question we hear all the time in clinic. I'm a brand new PSC patient with early stage disease. What advice as it relates to beer, wine, and/or hard liquor?
I was hoping you'd give that one to Josh. I'm a hepatologist. It's hard to be on a tape recorded conversation to talk about alcohol. So, the easy answer as a hepatologist is no amount of alcohol is safe. We don't know. And so if you're going to, play it the safest, zero alcohol, right? I will say if you have cirrhosis or advanced fibrosis, definitely zero alcohol, definitely, okay? Now, for an early PSC patient, if you have a very accurate assessment of your fibrosis, I also want to provide you with evidence or with advice that is practical. And I know it's not very helpful to say everybody with any liver disease should not drink alcohol. So what we do know is that the more fibrosis you have, the more alcohol you drink, that's no good. And then we also, where hepatologists, I think, have generally landed on is that for those without significant fibrosis, no more than one serving of alcohol for a woman per day, and no more than 2 servings of alcohol per day for a man. But do know that you kind of have to do a search of what a serving is, because the average serving at a restaurant, or probably that you might be pouring at home, is probably more like 2 or 3 servings, to be perfectly honest. And so if you've talked it over with your doctor, your PSC, your IBD doctor, and they say okay to drink a little bit of alcohol, just don't do more than 1 serving, do be very careful about what that serving is. But this is a very personalized, it has to be a really personalized discussion to make sure that that your doctor is okay knowing everything else about your case.
I'm with you, Jennifer. I sort of followed the special occasion rule, but
oh, that's a great one. I mean, I'd love to hear what both of you guys say.
Yeah, well, I'm going to turn it over. Actually, you guys have been tremendous. Thank you, Dr. Lai. Thank you, Dr. Korzenik. And that was just wonderful. Absolutely wonderful presentation and wonderful with questions and answers. And we thank you both. And Ricky, I'm going to turn it back over to you now to close things out. Thank you both.
Thanks to all 3 of you. Dan, you did a wonderful job moderating, and Dr. Lai and Dr. Korzenik, you discussed nutrition from 2 different perspectives, which was great. So Dr. Lai, you gave us that general overview with some practical suggestions and a lot of encouragement on how to follow some of those suggestions. And Dr. Korzenik teaching us how to apply IBD data to PSC, and your experience with your Dino study, which has great promise. So you both have, I think, dispelled a lot of nutritional myths for all of us, and great answers to all the questions. And I think we're all leaving tonight's webinar with suggestions on how to improve our our food choices. So I thank you for all of that. Thank you. This has been great. And next slide. So just a quick reminder before we leave today, this is a list of our upcoming post-conference educational series. That is listed on our website if you would like to take a look there. Next slide. For future events, please visit pscpartners.org. Join our patient registry to give us your patient data. It will really help research. Join the mentor program, listen to our monthly podcasts, visit links to updated COVID-19 and vaccine information, and sign up for a mailing list and follow us on social media. If you're in Canada, sign up for a mailing list and follow us on social media also. Just highlighting a couple of post-conference webinars that are coming up. On July 27th, we have Living with PSC, Psychosocial Stresses and Strains, Coping Strategies for Patients. This will be moderated by Dr. Jerome Schoferman, who is a retired physician as well as a post-transplant PSCer. And then on August 10th, we have a PSC IBD connection. Zoom rooms are starting up again. So we have our PSC Partners Mentor Program talking about peer support in a group session on July 19th. Then for PSC patients 18 and older, we'll have their Zoom room starting again on August 23rd. All of these are from 6 to 7:30 p.m. And then please do not forget, please join in Walk K83.01. It's our big annual fundraiser for PSC, raising money, hopefully for some research grant money. And next slide, again, I'd like to end by thanking all of our sponsors, community, and corporate. Without you, we could never have done all of this. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. Bye-bye.